All international travellers would need to provide a negative COVID-19 test result before they'll be allowed to enter England or Scotland. It comes amid continuing concerns about the distribution of COVID vaccines. Let's speak to the Transport Secretary now, Grant Shapps. Good morning to you, Minister.
Morning.
Before we launch into that topic of the testing, I just wanted to get your view on whether you think President Trump should go, in light of the news this morning that there has been a fifth death from the Capitol, from the storming of the Capitol.
I thought what happened completely dishonours democracy, and it was just despicable to see those people encouraged to go to the Capitol building and sort of basically ransack it like that. And as you say, there've been people's lives that have been lost as well. So leave it to the Americans to resolve. But America's a great democracy. They've got all the institutions in place, and the checks and balances are there. To see something like that happen in the United States was really quite extraordinary. And I know there'll be quite some reflection on that.
But what's your view? Do you think the 25th Amendment should be invoked?
Well, it's not for me to sort of interfere in American politics any more than I expect an American president or politician to do in the UK. But everyone saw those scenes from the film you just ran as well, and it is inescapable that people were encouraged to go march on the Capitol building as well. And the scenes are really quite despicable. But we'll leave it to the Americans. I'm sure they'll put the correct, whatever they feel the correct processes in place.
Even regarding the special relationship and our closest ally, you don't think it's our place to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot's always said about the special relationship, which is about the office of the president and about the head of state and America itself, rather than individuals. And I think it's very important to sort of separate the two out. But in the same way as I wouldn't expect Americans to tell us, for example, how we should handle, anything from the Brexit process we went through to anything else in our own politics. I wouldn't expect to tell the Americans how to run things. That's their call. But everyone could see the scenes on TV, utterly condemn them. I thought it was despicable. I thought it dishonoured a great democracy as well. But I think we can very fairly leave it to the Americans to work out what they should do next. That's their call, clearly.
OK, let's move on to testing as regards England and Scotland for people arriving into the country. Lay out to us exactly what the new rules will be.
Well, very simply, if you're coming here from anywhere, whether you're a Brit or whether you're a foreign national, then you will need to take a COVID test up to 72 hours before you come here. I should say immediately, it doesn't actually change the other things that you'll need to do. In other words, the quarantine, if you're coming from somewhere which isn't on the travel corridor, it remains in place. So you'll still need to do those things as well. But this is an extra check, and we're doing this now because there are these variants that we're very, very keen to keep out of the country, like the South African variant, for example.
I was just going to ask, why exactly are you bringing this in now when the travel industry have been calling for this for months? They wanted something like this put in place to alleviate the pressure that they're under.
Well, I want to be clear about what this is and it isn't. It's sensible because there's a new version of the variant out there, the South African variant. We saw the mink one the other week. And there are concerns with the South African one in particular about how effective the vaccine would be against it. So we simply cannot take chances. But in terms of response to the coronavirus, the only really surefire way is to make sure that people quarantine or self-isolate. And of course, we've had that in place for months and months since last June. So today, because of that variant, it's become much more urgent. We're not the only ones. I just saw this morning Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, has actually introduced exactly the same thing today for the first time, testing before arrival. But as I say, in our case, and actually in Canada's case, it doesn't remove the need to quarantine as well, I'm afraid.
But lots of other countries have had strict entry requirements when it comes to COVID testing before now. Why have we left it so late?
The simple answer is that actually, when you say it's a strict requirement, it's nowhere near as strict as requiring self isolation or quarantine, which will have a far better chance, nearly 100% chance when it's done properly, to ensure that the coronavirus isn't spread from somebody who's infectious. The difficulty that we've always had with testing, and that difficulty remains, I don't want to make any bones about it, is if you test somebody but they're asymptomatic, and somebody who's about to fly, for example, would have to have been asymptomatic, otherwise they shouldn't have been flying in the first place, then they can still be carrying the virus. So you have a test on whichever day, up to 3 days before. It doesn't show that somebody definitely doesn't have the virus. It's just another layer, another test. And you ask why now, as I mentioned, the South African mutation of coronavirus is one reason. The other is that we've had to sort of wait for the sector, for the industry globally, to be able to provide enough coronavirus tests and to be able to do so to the right kind of standard. So it's a bit technical, but we're not asking for the PCR test, which you often hear about. What instead we're asking for, a test of a particular sensitivity and what's called specificity. So up to a certain standard, in other words. And those can be PCR tests or what are called lateral flow tests or LAMP tests. The point is, there are just enough of those around now to make this a workable approach to having one extra check, an extra layer of security. But as I say, not the be all and end all.
So by your logic, to add an even further extra layer of security, why not test at the airport?
Well, so if you're testing before somebody comes here, and then you're testing, remember, either 5 days later, if people are using what's called the test to release scheme, so you have to then quarantine and test, or indeed having to carry out the full quarantine, that's 10 days, then that's giving us absolute certainty about it, because the sort of gold standard really is quarantine or self-isolation. There's no test can beat what that does. So this gives you sort of, if you like, the best of both worlds. You take a test up front, you hope you're going to catch some people who are asymptomatic, they don't know they've got it, but it turns out that they have when they take that test, and therefore they can't fly and don't fly. But it's really the quarantine, the self-isolation, that's the bit that really deals with preventing.
So are you categorically ruling out testing at airports? Because what we're hearing from the airports is that the units are ready and waiting to go and to be deployed, but they simply don't have the agreement from government.
No, that's not right, actually. I mean, I was speaking to the boss of Heathrow last night. Testing at airports has been going on for months at Heathrow. It's used all the time. When you fly to countries, Italy, Spain, France, you require testing, and often people will do that at the airport. Though I should absolutely stress, people shouldn't be flying anywhere. At the moment, we're in a lockdown situation, of course, with only very few exceptions. But people coming here will often take that test, which can be up to 72 hours before. They'll often do that at the airport in Rome or wherever they happen to be at the time before they fly here. So testing in airports is already a thing. It's just that sometimes people have talked about testing in airports as if it was some sort of silver bullet solution. The point I'm trying to make is it isn't. Unfortunately, it doesn't actually detect the majority of asymptomatic cases. The thing which does sort that out is isolation or quarantine. That's the thing which is still the gold standard, and it's still, I'm afraid, going to be part of the solution here.
How will you enforce people test before travelling and have a negative test before they actually travel? Will that be left up to the airline?
Yeah, the carriers, which could be an airline, it could be, of course, it could be the train, or it could be a ferry, will be required by law to check, just in the same way as they check you have a passport, or if you're going to, say, the States, a visa or a visa waiver, they'll need to check whether you have a coronavirus test valid within the 72 hours before you fly. They're also already having to check for what's called the passenger locator form. That's the thing which enables us to be able to contact somebody if we then later find that they've been in contact with someone who has coronavirus. So for the time being, I'm afraid these passenger locator forms and this coronavirus test are realities of travel. But good news, as we know from the Prime Minister's press conference last night, we already have 1.5 million of the most vulnerable people in the UK vaccinated, more than the whole of the rest of Europe put together, in fact. And that number is going to be increasing very, very quickly, with 1,000 GP-led vaccination stations by next week. So we very much want to get to a point where we don't have to have any of these things, where people are in fact vaccinated and we can return to life as normal. So that's where we want to go. This is not something we want to do permanently, but for the time being, we must keep people safe.
Now, Scotland has confirmed it will follow the plan, but Wales and Northern Ireland haven't done so as yet. That leaves a gap in the defence, doesn't it? Because somebody could fly into Wales or travel by train into Wales and then drive to England.
Well, I don't want to overspeak for Wales or Northern Ireland. They have their own administrations, but I'm pretty certain they'll end up actually being part of this. I spoke to them yesterday, and they're certainly indicating that they would want to be a part of it. So I suspect it will be a UK-wide requirement from at some point next week.
Previously, we relied just on quarantining, as you suggested, for people coming into the country. Would it be fair to say that our borders, up until now, have been unsafe?
No, absolutely not. And here's the proof, by the way. A lot of people said to me, why don't you just shut the borders, close it entirely? And putting aside the fact that we're, an island and we require people and goods and things in order to be able to sort of function at all, bring in the medicine, bring in the PPE. But putting all of that aside, look what happened in the United States, for example, where they did last March entirely close the border. So Brits haven't been able to fly to America since last March, no one in Europe. It hasn't helped them at all, not one iota. And that is because, as I confirmed with the chief medical officer, I asked him about this right at the beginning, should we close the borders? He said, there is no point in doing so. You will delay the whole thing by 4 or 5 days. You'll stop the flow of goods and medicines, important transactions taking place, and you won't stop the virus once it's already here. What we're doing, though, with the ability now, with the mass testing that's now available, and the ability to ask people to be tested, is to try to prevent a new variant from entering the country. We've done it, as I mentioned before. Canada, I see, have done it overnight as well. So it's a slightly different thing that we're trying to do.
Going to have to interrupt you there. We have run out of time, sadly. Thank you very much for speaking to us this morning.
You're welcome.